Another myth is that thinking about suicide means you will commit suicide. Many people have fleeting, occasional suicidal thoughts, but they don't act on them. Have you ever been going down the freeway and thought to yourself, what it would be like if I veered off to the right and ran into the Jersey barrier? Or what would it be like if I went off the road and slammed into a tree? Or what if I swam out beyond my swimming ability? You ever had any of those fleeting thoughts? They don't lodge there. You don't spend time thinking about it, developing it, but it kind of passes through, and then you think, that was kind of strange. I wonder where that thought came from. Why would I even think that? The key concern is not whether somebody has a thought about suicide, but whether they dwell on that thought, and do they construct a plan. The key concern is making a plan. Then you know that you're dealing with something that is indeed serious. Another common myth is if you talk about suicide to a suicidal subject, you may encourage them to do it. This is probably the most restricting myth. We are so afraid. If somebody comes up to us and said, I'm thinking about hurting myself, I'm thinking about suicide, what's your natural reaction? Change the subject. Okay? Or if you can't change the subject, find some way to get away. You don't want to be there. You don't want to talk about this. Why? Because you don't know what to say, and you're afraid that you'll say the wrong thing, and that will set it off, and that you will be responsible for that person's suicide. The truth is, if somebody comes to you and says, I'm thinking about hurting myself, I'm having some suicidal thoughts, they're troubled by what's going on. And that by talking to them, it may actually provide a release for them that instead of putting them over the edge, actually pulls them away from the edge. It's counterintuitive, but it's what you need to do. Don't run away. Don't panic. Don't be afraid of saying the wrong thing. You are likely, whatever you say, if you show real interest, it's going to be helpful, not harmful. Another myth is that a true believer cannot commit suicide. The truth is that medical side effects and other factors may prevail. There was a pastor in Birmingham years ago, widely known to be a godly man, a dear man, a solid preacher of the word and a powerful preacher. And one night, to everyone's surprise, he took a pistol out of his desk drawer and shot himself in the head. In the days following, everybody tried to make sense out of it. He had had some heart issues. This was quite a few years ago. A lot of the heart medications were new. And he'd had some heart issues and was put on a new medication. And when his wife read the small print, it said that the medication may cause suicidal thoughts. This man was a believer. This man was a faithful pastor. But he did do what he did. Do you remember Jonah? I don't mean were you there when Jonah preached, but do you remember Jonah? And how after he went, he is the most reluctant missionary, and he is the most disappointed missionary in the success of his mission. And in Jonah chapter 4, Jonah goes off, and the scripture says that he was greatly displeased and angry. Who was he angry with? He was angry with God. The Hebrew text literally says that he was angry because to him it was a great evil. What God had done was a great evil in saving those people. And do you remember his prayer when God confronts him? He tells him about his anger, and then he says, "Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it's better for me to die than to live." Now, that's not suicidal. Jonah didn't say, "I'm going to take my life." But what did he say? "Lord, you take my life." Why? Because from my perspective, it's better for me to die than to live. Now, that's about as close to suicidal thinking as you can get without being suicidal. You follow? He didn't cross the line. He left it in God's sovereign hands. You take my life. But his thinking was very much like the thinking of a suicidal person. It's better for me to die than to live. The Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, in verse 8, after talking to the Corinthians about the hardships and sufferings that he experienced in Asia, Paul said, under great pressure, far beyond my ability to endure, so that he despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. Again, what I'm saying is, Paul, any questions about his salvation? Any questions about him as a believer? But his thinking veered in the direction of being parallel to the thinking of someone who might be suicidal. The suicide takes it a little further and says, I'll take care of it. I'll take my own life. But Jonah and Paul despaired of life. They were unhappy with life. They believed that it would be better to die than to live under these circumstances. So don't be so quick to condemn somebody who's a believer and says, I'm struggling with these thoughts. Another one. Suicide happens without warning. How often do you hear somebody say after suicide, we never saw it. We didn't see any signs. There were no indications. Again, the reality is that most people give warning signs. At least 75% is the number that's given out. At least 75% of people give warning signs. And actually, I think the number is higher than that. It's just that we don't recognize the warning signs. Another myth, once suicidal, always suicidal. And when somebody confesses to having suicidal thoughts, then they're always marked by that, the rest of their lives. People have that wondering look. Well, that's not so. People who are thinking about suicide, when they survive that difficult period, can overcome that by the grace of the gospel. I used to be not so happy with the idea of a 72-hour hold, a mandatory confinement in a psychiatric hospital. But I've become more of a fan because I've recognized that a 72-hour hold enables a suicidal subject to be in a safe place until they get past a critical period and are then able to open their eyes and consider other options. Now, I may not like the counseling they get in that psychiatric hospital, Okay? Fair enough. But I can deal with that better than I can deal with them not being in a safe place and losing their life. So we need to look at that 72-hour hold as something that could be beneficial. Now, just a few more myths. A lot of myths, aren't there? Another myth is that the risk goes down when the mood goes up. Somebody may be going like this, and they are discouraged, and they are depressed, and they go along for a while, and then they begin to feel better, and they act like they're happy. They're beginning to look like their old self. They act like their old self, and we misinterpret that. I'll explain a little bit further later. But we misinterpret that and think because the mood is going up, the risk is going down. The reality is the risk may be going up. And the happiness or the appearance of happiness, the peace that they seem to have, may be because they have made a decision and now know what they're going to do. It's no longer something they're wrestling with. They're done wrestling. Now it's just a matter of carrying out what they've said they will do. Another myth, suicidal people are intent on dying. We often represent suicidal people as having a death wish. More often, it's not that they want to die. It's that they want to end the pain. And they think they are out of options, and therefore they are out of hope. There's a difference between wanting to die and not wanting to go on living with things the way they are. Do you see the difference? A difference between wanting to die, my wish is to die, and not wanting to go on living with things the way they are. I want things to change. I don't know how to change them. I can't do the change that's required. I can't seem to gather together the will to do the things that are required. A few more. Suicide runs in families. We often hear that. If somebody commits suicide, we look at the family history. Maybe somebody else committed suicide, and our minds kind of link it. This is a family trait. This is a family characteristic. So when I go to a suicide scene, I'm often dealing with the family members who are wondering if a young person takes their life. The brother or sister may be wondering, am I next? Am I going to do that? And it's often true that suicide does run in families, but it's not hereditary. There's no hereditary link. Rather, look for patterns and what I call permission. If Uncle Joe was overwhelmed by life's issues and difficulties, and he concluded his best way to deal with that was to take himself out, then that gives permission to the next generation to say, that's what Uncle Joe did. If I get in that fix, I can do the same. It's okay. I can do that. That's the same principle that's at work in what are sometimes called copycat, or more recently, contagion suicides. You know what a contagion suicide is, or copycat? Somebody commits suicide, and then over the next couple of weeks, maybe someone else does, or a couple of people do. And it seems like the one sparked the others. There may be no direct connection, but it's the idea and the publicization of the one that says to others, I can do that. You had two back-to-back suicides here in Littleton just last month. A high school student who jumped off a parking garage, and a middle school student the next day who shot himself. I've not read of any direct connection between them, but it looks very much like a contagion. It's not contagious in the sense of a cold is contagious, but a contagion suicide. One leads to another. Interestingly, both of these young men posted what they were about to do on social media. They let it be known. And there were some, in at least one case, there were some who reported it to the authorities, but by the time they could reach the individual, it was already done. One more, and this is a big one. Suicidal people must be mentally ill. Suicidal people must be mentally ill. Nevada, back in 2007, drafted a suicide prevention plan. They had a spike in suicides. They were very concerned to deal with it. They drafted a 5-year plan to reduce suicides. It didn't have much effect. But I read that plan and I found this in the plan. See if you hear the same thing. 90% of people who die by suicide have a diagnosable mental health and/or substance use disorder at the time of death. 90%. Only 4 sentences later, however, it acknowledges that over 90% of the people that died by suicide in Nevada had not been seen by a mental health professional. Do you see a problem there? We assert, absolutely, 90% have a diagnosable mental health disorder. But then we say 90% of the people that died never saw a mental health professional. Where'd they get the diagnosis? This is circular reasoning. In our minds, somebody's got to be out of their mind to take their life. So if so-and-so took their life, they must be out of their mind. And so we take that paint can of mental illness and we spread it abroad and label everybody who takes their life as mentally ill. We'll see in a little while that's simply not true. Can mental illness, can those illnesses that affect the brain, those biological illnesses, brain injury, cancer, some of those, yes, those things can certainly affect somebody's behavior and their thinking, but not what we typically consider to be mental illness.